28th of February in African History Revolution. Resistance and the rewriting of power. What if I told you that on 28th February, a revolution stood at the edge of civil war? Liberation movements felt the tremors of collapsing empires, and Africa's political future was quietly being redesigned. History doesn't always explode in one dramatic moment. Sometimes it builds day by day until a single date becomes the tipping point. February is one of those dates. On this day in different years, Africa confronted dictatorship, accelerated the fall of colonial rule, and reshaped continental governance. To understand 28th of February is to understand how Africa moves through crisis, not passively but with agency, debate, and consequence. Let's begin in North Africa. In 2011, Libya was no longer simply experiencing protests. It was standing at the threshold of war. The Arab Spring had already transformed Tunisia, and Egypt demonstrations calling for political reform, economic justice, and the end of long-standing authoritarian rule were spreading rapidly in Libya. Protests against the government erupted in mid-February 2011. But by 28 February, the uprising had evolved into something far more volatile. Cities in eastern Libya, particularly Benghazi, were slipping from central government control. Protesters had become organized resistance groups. Military units were defecting. Weapons depots were being seized. State authority, once firmly centralized, under Gaddafi's 42-year rule, was fracturing. Gaddafi had taken power in 1969 after overthrowing King Idris I in a bloodless coup. Presenting himself as a revolutionary, anti-imperialist, he introduced a political philosophy outlined in his Green Book. He rejected traditional parliamentary democracy and instead promoted what he called direct rule by the people. The Jamahiriya oil revenues funded infrastructure. Education and healthcare. Libya achieved one of the highest literacy rates in Africa. Yet political dissent was suppressed. Opposition parties were banned, and critics were often imprisoned or silenced. By late February 2011, that system was unraveling. On 28th of February, international concern escalated. Reports of airstrikes, civilian casualties, and violent crackdowns drew global attention. The United Nations began preparing sanctions. Within days, asset freezes and travel bans targeted Libyan leadership figures. The African Union called for restraint and dialogue, wary of foreign military intervention, and conscious of the instability that could follow regime collapse. Inside Libya, however, events were moving too quickly for diplomacy alone to contain. Armed confrontations intensified tribes. Cities and political factions began choosing sides. What had begun as protest for reform now carried the momentum of revolution. By October 2011, Gaddafi would be captured and killed. But 28th of February marks the moment when the world recognized that Libya was not experiencing a temporary disturbance. It was entering a full-scale transformation. Yet revolution is only one chapter in political change. The aftermath matters just as much. In the years following 2011, Libya faced competing governments, militia rule, economic disruption, and repeated attempts at national reconciliation. The fall of a long-standing ruler created a vacuum that institutions struggled to fill. It revealed a critical lesson, repeated throughout history. Dismantling authority is often faster than rebuilding stable governance. Still, the courage of those who demanded political participation cannot be erased. The 28th of February. 2011 symbolizes both the power and the complexity of popular uprising in modern Africa. But this date carries echoes beyond Libya. Travel back to the mid-1970s, a decisive era in the collapse of Portuguese colonial rule. By late February 1974, liberation movements in Angola and Mozambique sensed that change was approaching. Portugal had maintained control over its African territories longer than most European powers. Armed resistance had intensified throughout the 1960s. In Mozambique, the liberation movement Frelimo waged guerrilla warfare against colonial forces. In Angola, the MPA, FNLA, and UNITA were all engaged in anti-colonial struggle, though they differed ideologically and politically. February 1974 fell just weeks before Portugal's Carnation Revolution. In April, the military coup in Lisbon that overthrew the authoritarian Estado Novo regime. Though the revolution itself occurred later, the pressure from prolonged colonial wars had already weakened Portugal internally. By 28 February 1974, liberation fighters across southern Africa were operating with increasing confidence. The Portuguese army was overstretched. Domestic dissent within Portugal was rising. The cost of empire had become unsustainable. Within a year, Angola and Mozambique would gain independence in 1975. Yet independence, like revolution, brought its own challenges.